Welcome. My name is Elizabeth Santin, and I'm Vice President of Applied Scientific Curiosity at JEFO, and we are pleased to be sponsoring this session. As a global supplier of precision nutrition, we understand our role in sustainability, and we work together to stay very much in line with this. At JEFO, we believe that sharing knowledge is essential to reach a healthier circle of life on a more sustainable planet.
I'm Michael Bocadoro, Executive Director of Dairy Cares, and wanted to do a special thank you to Jeffo Nutrition, one of our important sponsors for the Dairy Sustainability Conference. I'm actually really excited. We've had two great panels already this morning, and I've been looking forward to this next discussion for some time. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation today on climate neutrality for the U.S. beef and dairy cattle production. And we've got two great panelists. I've known them both for a while, and two of the most informed global experts on livestock methane emissions. Both of them are well known to all of us in the livestock sector. Dr. Sarah Place is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Alanko, where she provides expertise on sustainability issues to customers and supports Alanko's healthy purpose. Prior to Alanko, she was the Senior Director for Sustainable Beef Production Research at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and an Assistant Professor in Sustainable Beef Cattle Systems at Oklahoma State University. One of my favorite golf courses there at Oklahoma State, Karsten Creek. I love that place. And then Dr. Frank Mitloehner, Professor and Air Quality Specialist at UC Davis, arguably the world's #1 agricultural school. Not just here in California, the US, and the world. And as you probably already guessed it, my alma mater as well. Dr. Mitloehner has served as chairman of Global UN Food and Agriculture Organization Partnership Project to benchmark the environmental footprint of livestock production. And he serves as North American scientific lead for the Global Feed LCA. Welcome to both of you. We're going to have a great, really informal discussion. It's nice having two panelists that know each other well and know the topic well. And so let's jump right into it and get a little definition to help guide our discussion. And we've heard lots of different terms and pledges like net zero, carbon neutral. What does it mean, and what's it mean in particular to be climate neutral? Sarah, do you want to take the lead on that? And Frank, feel free to jump in.
Really a good question, because there are a lot of terms thrown out there and it's hard to know what all these things mean, right? So I think classically when we think about carbon neutral, we hear about that so much, that really is specifically referring to having net zero or zero carbon dioxide emissions. And so just carbon dioxide, right? So that's what carbon neutral refers to. When we get into some of these other terms, whether it's net zero greenhouse gas emissions, climate neutral, that's more referring to the bigger bucket of all the different emission sources and thinking about either one, trying to get those emissions themselves to a net zero state. And I think as we'll expand upon in the next few minutes here, the question is really what metric are we using to define zero in that case? Or if we're talking about something like climate neutral, it really is trying to get to a point where the activities of whether it's an industry sector or a nation or globally, we're no longer adding to warming, which is always important to ground ourselves with. That's why we care about this whole issue from a climate perspective, is to stop increasing temperatures, the global average increase in temp.
Frank, anything you wanted to add, or?
Well, I can just second what she said, and Sarah, good job. The Paris Climate Accord really doesn't have an emissions goal. It has a temperature goal. And the goal globally is to not add any additional warming beyond 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. And that means that all sectors, including the dairy sector, shall not add additional warming. And so the question is, how can we prevent that? And how can we maybe even offset some of the other emissions, some of the emissions that we produce today, or all of them, and even some of the historic contributions. And so this is what climate neutrality is all about. To me, this is what really counts, that we get to a point where we don't cause additional warming. In fact, maybe undo some of the historic warming.
So we've heard a lot about methane over the course of the last couple of years and its importance. And why is it important that we think about methane differently from some of the other greenhouse gases? And what role is it going to play in the overall impact? Either of you can jump in on that and the other can follow.
So globally, there's no question that CO2 is the most abundant greenhouse gas, and it also has the greatest contribution to warming in an absolute way. But methane is a greenhouse gas that's very potent, that has a great punch to it. The good thing about methane, and that's kind of unique, is that methane is not just produced, it's also destroyed. A process called hydroxyl oxidation destroys it. And that means methane, as a result, has a short lifespan. And that really changes the whole dynamic, or as it changes how methane warms our planet. And if we manage methane well, then we can have short-term effects on climate. And that's what we are seeking to do. And finally, why is methane such a big deal? Because that's the main greenhouse gas we in animal agriculture have to worry about, because that's the most abundant one we produce.
Sarah, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. So I think that's a great overview, and really just to reemphasize, right, what matters when it comes to greenhouse gases is really what the concentration of those gases are in the atmosphere, right? And so when we talk about emissions, we're thinking about how are we contributing potentially to the increases of those concentrations, because that's what drives the heat trapping ability of the gas, right? And so as Frank mentioned, because methane is such a short-lived gas, it really is just that opportunity that we, through the impact of our emissions, either reductions, right, or how we affect those emissions, can have a faster impact on the atmospheric concentration of methane. That's really what matters. So I think that's what's key, is that's why there's so much interest around trying to reduce methane emissions, is it's almost a quicker bang for your buck in terms of a temperature response than any of the other gases, just because of that short-lived nature, right? And the ability through human activity to hopefully stabilize, right, stop increasing methane concentrations. In the longer run, obviously, ideally, you could potentially bring those back down.
Great. So tell us more for what it means in the overall climate goals, and methane in particular, and the role it's going to play, not just here in California and the US, but globally.
Yeah, so I think we have a slide to kind of try to help pull this through, and hopefully everybody's hanging with us in the morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, to look at something like this. But I think this is really important to emphasize some of the things that we've already touched on. And this graphic that we're looking at here comes from the special report that was published back in 2018 on how do we stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius from the IPCC. And so what we're looking at, this bigger chart on the left-hand side, is the estimations of what future emissions scenarios have to be for CO2 alone. So this is just carbon dioxide, for us to stay within 1.5 degrees and not, what is listed here, overshoot that temperature target. And so as Frank mentioned, right, that's really what the Paris Climate Accord is about, staying within 2 degrees C to ideally 1.5 degrees C temperature change globally. So what you'll notice when you look at that CO2 chart, right, the emissions have to cross that y-axis, which is 0, at some point in the future. So net emissions, meaning the sum of all the emissions and all the fossil fuel burning that we do, plus all carbon sequestration, is going to have to hit 0 for us to stop adding warming. And that's what's super unique about CO2, is it's a gas that accumulates, right? So until we stop adding more CO2, we're not going to stop the warming increases from CO2, if that makes sense. So that's the key takeaway. Net zero CO2 is pretty straightforward. You got to get it to 0. The other thing that's on this chart, though, is on the right-hand side is non-CO2 emissions. So we have methane listed here, black carbon, we won't really go into that, and nitrous oxide, which is the other most important gas from agriculture. And what you'll note there is those emissions do not go to 0, right? That's called out pretty distinctly. They need to be reduced or stabilize, but they do not need to be zero to stay within the temperature budget. And this comes back to what we were saying earlier about the fast-lived nature of methane and what Frank mentioned about trying to be in balance, emissions being in balance with sinks. So I think that's what's super important is that because of this reality that CO2 must equal zero, but non-CO2 emissions do not, this kind of leads us to that discussion of, well, how do we make sure that our metrics kind of reflect this complexity of what our targets need to be for different gases, if that makes sense.
Frank, anything you'd like to add?
I'm sorry?
Anything you'd like to add, Frank? Oops, we seem...
Reduce methane, we net pull carbon out of the air. And so a reduction of methane has a almost instantaneous impact on warming. And that's why it's such a big deal in us achieving climate neutrality. It really circled the whole prospect of the dairy and beef industry to reaching climate neutrality circles around methane, because a strong reduction will offset other greenhouse gases. And that makes it a very important opportunity. Some people ask me, Frank, do you actually love methane? I'm like, no, I don't love it, but I certainly don't hate it. I view it not as much as a liability as I view it as an asset. And I think that's what we should all think of. We should think of loss of methane being a net loss of energy. It's like leaving your door and windows open in the middle of winter. You don't want to do that because you lose heat from your house. You also don't want to lose methane from your cows if you can help it, and you don't want to lose methane from the manure lagoons if you can help it. If you minimize these losses, then you are actively, or if you even reduce them, then you are reducing warming, and that's a real opportunity.
Great. Let's move into a little different area here. And as we just heard on the previous panel from Nestle and Starbucks, major food companies and other companies are setting some very ambitious goals, particularly within the livestock sector. As we better understand the science, sort of our topic here today, have there been, and do there need to be, changes in how these goals are both framed and defined?
Yeah, so I'll start on this. I think there's been some variety of goals out there, right? Language around net zero and maybe not a lot of specificity as to what that means, and some specific goals around climate neutrality, right? So I think the key thing there is, of course, goals that truly are about carbon neutrality. If they include ruminant agriculture in the supply chain, probably don't make too much sense, right? As we just discussed, there are other gases beyond CO2 that we need to pay attention to for ruminant ag production, including dairy and beef cattle. And when we think about net zero greenhouse gas emissions, I think that goal is consistent with the idea of, trying to stay within a temperature target. It really comes down to the specifics of how it will be measured. And as I alluded to a little bit ago, what metrics we're using, right? Because there are ways to use metrics of a variety of gases that allow for a zero value to mean zero warming. And there are other metrics we can choose where we basically get nonsensical values, if you will, in terms of, we always look like we're contributing to warming, even if we cut our emissions. And I think that's the key thing is digging in a little deeper into those high level commitments and saying, how are we actually going to define this specifically, right? And right size our emission reductions to temperature goals.
Frank, anything you'd like to add, or I'm going to take it in another slightly different direction?
Yeah, I'm currently here in Switzerland, and I can tell you here in Europe, the whole continent talks about climate neutrality and means of how to achieve climate neutrality. And I completely agree with it. The concept overall is new to many places in the United States, but I think we have to move into this direction because it is all about the warming and not just about carbon emissions. And particularly, that issue is particularly important for livestock because of the role it plays in the livestock sector.
And that's actually a really good transition to my next question for you, Frank. And what are some of the key points as regulators seek to manage climate emissions? And does methane need to be regulated differently than carbon dioxide?
Well, I think I think that methane should be viewed differently compared to other greenhouse gases because of the fact that they are not just sources but also sinks, and that changes the behavior of that gas on warming. I do think that we currently use a so-called matrix, a way of comparing methane to other gases called GWP 100, that is not really fit for purpose because it does not account for the actual impact of that gas on warming, particularly not if you have a constant source of methane or if you have a decreasing source of methane. This unit that is currently being used is not depicting the impact of an industry accurately, that is either constant in its emissions or that is decreasing over time. And so to me, the first move is to consider carefully what matrix to use, and you will see that the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change and others are hotly debating that right now. There will be a United Nations FAO report coming out on this topic very soon as well. But in my opinion, the best way of approaching greenhouse gases is to account for them separately by gas. Methane separately from CO2, separately from nitrous oxide, and not trying to get them all normalized in some emission equivalent number. One point that I also want to make is I believe that, and that's probably most important to everybody, not so much how we quantify, but how we mitigate and what these mitigations mean. If we strongly mitigate methane, then we are net pulling carbon from the atmosphere. And that net reduction will have a significant impact on the warming impact of this industry. I think I've seen amazing results in California as to how our farmers have reduced methane. I've heard numbers of 25% methane reductions from California dairy manure, which is sensational. And I'm reminded to what that means, that strong methane reduction has a wonderful impact on warming reduction. Now, in my opinion, the way to further intensify additional reductions has to be accompanied by public policy measures. And in my opinion, it should be incentivized financially because the farmers can do it, but it's not cost neutral. It will cost money in many cases. And therefore, the public sector has to decide whether or not these strong reductions are worth public investments. In my opinion, they definitely are.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that was a good overview, right? Of ultimately, if our goal is to stop warming contributions, then we do need to think about those gases separately, right? And it's kind of like that chart I shared. We'll need different targets for different gases, and I think it's not too much of a departure from what we're currently doing, but again, it's just changing that mindset of. It sounds weird at first, but basically methane emissions do not have to be zero to have zero climate impact, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's the key thing. And we just need to say, well, how much do they need to reduce? And as Frank alluded to, there's great examples of when we do incentivize practices to reduce what we call absolute emissions, total emissions, we get that response, right? So we should really think about that example that's taken place in California and how we could potentially build upon that in other places to achieve those absolute emission reductions.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion going on in California, certainly today, about the incentive-based approach. We heard a little bit about it this morning on one of the early panels, and we're going to hear about it, I think, throughout the next couple of days. And that's the importance of producer-driven incentive-based approaches. And want you both to talk a little bit about why that approach is so important, particularly with the dairy sector and the livestock sector in general.
Yeah, I think what we see is the proof is in the pudding, right, of what's already taken place and the achievements that have been made in California in terms of reducing absolute emissions. And I keep saying absolute because that's a big deal, right? That's what we actually have to reduce is the total amount of emissions, and to be able to do that and maintain a viable industry at the same time, right? So as Frank alluded to, right, some of these things that are required on the manure side are going to be capital intensive. And so I think it makes a whole lot of sense if we're talking about the public good, which is the shared atmosphere we all are living in, that we should think about how do we collectively impact and provide the right incentives to incentivize that behavior, right? So it also kind of comes back to that idea in economics, right, of this idea of externalities, right? Things that aren't currently being priced in. I think that's important for us to think about. If that's the case, and if we truly are, as a society, dedicated to reducing emissions, then we need to be able to pay for that, right, to make it happen. A great example there is if we think about voluntary carbon markets today in the U.S. I mean, the carbon value or the price per metric ton of CO2 equivalent emissions is somewhere around $3 to $5. So there's some payment there. But if you think about it from like a crop farmer perspective or a dairy farmer that's going to say put in no-till practices and try to get maybe half a metric ton per acre of CO2 in soil carbon storage, well, that's only maybe $1.50 an acre incentive. So I think we need to think through those things in real economic terms, right? Is somebody going to buy new equipment, change their entire management strategy, potentially alter labor, all these different things if the incentive is so low, right? So it really just does come down to the nuts and bolts of running a business and cash flowing it and making sure that we're providing the right incentives to get the outcomes that we desire.
Frank?
Obviously,
Anything you'd like to add?
Obviously, but some of the numbers I hear are just staggering. I hear that 3% of all public investment funds to reduce methane in the state of California, 3% of those go into the dairy sector. But they generate 30% of the state's methane reductions in this, in this publicly funded realm. And so that to me is a 10x return on investment. And I think it should convince anyone looking at the financials of that this is public money well spent. In my opinion, we are not at the end of it. We are in the midst. I think that there will be technologies that have been shown to work that will be implemented even at more dairies in the future. And the focus will not just be on manure in the future, but also on enteric, meaning that methane that's belched out by cattle, as well as, maybe nitrous oxide from other sources and so forth. I think that we have a model, and by the way, I can assure you that model is the envy to many places in the world. Last week I was in Uruguay. This week I'm in Switzerland. The reason for being in these different places is because they want to learn how can we copy what's going on? How can we emulate the success that your industry is experiencing? And what kind of public policy tools and so on are there? They will definitely reach out to the California Air Resources Board and others to find out what that model is, that magic juice, as they call it. What is it that we do in the state that works, and how can it be an export article, so to say?
Yeah, I sometimes think the appreciation we get from other places is even greater appreciation than what we get here at home. We've got a very vocal anti-dairy community here in California that's constantly pushing for a regulated dairy sector. They don't like incentives. They think incentives don't lead to the right solutions. You hit the nail on the head. We've made tremendous progress, Frank, and I was thinking about it the other day. We're only about just over 5 years into the SB 1383 realm, and we have until 2030, which means we've got a little over 8 years through the end of 2030 to continue making progress. And so we've got a lot of work to still do, without a doubt, particularly on the enteric side, but we're making tremendous progress. And I'm always fearful when I hear the regulation word, because to me, regulation leads to one thing, and it's not what you just described, leadership, which other people will follow. Regulation will likely lead to leakage. And just how big of a problem is leakage? And when you're looking particularly at a state like California, can you island yourself, right, and try and regulate the industry here, recognizing global demand is increasing, national demand for dairy is also increasing? How do you regulate without getting leakage?
Well, first of all, just so everybody understands what that means, leakage means that if you, let's say, reduce 10% of the California herd and they're now going to other places, then these cows are taking emissions with them and just emit those gases at other places where they end up being. Leakage does not lead to a reduction of emissions in most cases. In fact, if the other places where your cattle and the farms go are less efficient, then that leads to greater emissions and not fewer emissions. Now, some agencies say, well, why do I care? That's no longer my state, it's no longer my business, but it is all of our business because we are all concerned about a changing climate and we don't want to add additional greenhouse gases or just move shells around. And just one more word of what you said before, Michael. Those people who are critical of the model that is currently being used and the technologies that are currently being used, they should please bring to the table alternatives that they think will use and are quantified to work, because I haven't seen any, and I don't think there are any. And we have a unique momentum going on right now that I would hate to see it getting lost. If something works well, why change it?
Sarah, anything you'd like to add on that topic?
Yeah, it is. It's a great question, and this idea of leakage, right? Because it's coming back to even some of the remarks you made in your opening statement, Michael, your opening TED talk, if you will, of thinking about productivity and the reality that at the end of the day, right, we still have probably 30, 40 years where we're going to have a growing world population, increasing incomes, and dairy demand will grow globally, right? So if we in the United States or in the state of California, a place that's very productive and has a pretty low carbon footprint of production, reduce our production, there's a strong likelihood that someplace else in the world is going to make that up, and that's going to have more emissions associated with each pound of milk or each gallon, right? Every piece of cheese that somebody's going to eat. So we do have to be smart in thinking about basically this idea of where our system boundaries is, right? That kind of sounds like a fancy term, but basically, again, the idea of if we're regulating something in, say, the state of California, the point that was brought up by Frank, right? If really all we're doing is just moving cows to Idaho and Texas, and we haven't changed anything in the U.S. dairy herd in terms of reducing methane, then it's kind of questionable if we can really count that as a true reduction. Whereas when we think about something like a manure technology where we are truly reducing and destroying methane that would have been emitted without the intervention, right? I think that's the powerful interventions that we need, those so-called absolute emissions reductions. And we should just pay attention to the fact that we have to eat, right? So we're talking about dairy today, we're talking about animal agriculture, but this is true across agriculture, right? It's an essential industry. And again, think back to that chart I shared earlier, right? Even the IPCC recognizes that, right? The nitrous oxide emissions are not assumed to go to zero. Methane's not assumed to go to zero because there are greenhouse gas emissions associated with the essential things in life, right? So it's for us to be smart about that, think about this holistically, do what we can, and really, again, seek to find and develop those solutions that truly result in reductions in absolute emissions in reality, right? That's our key opportunity in this space, whether enteric or in manure interventions.
So we've been talking a lot about climate neutrality in this panel today, and we've already noted that we've made a lot of strides in terms of already reducing a significant amount of methane here in California. We know our herd size is shrinking a little bit while production's being maintained, and we expect some additional shrinkage going forward. So with that in mind, Frank, when are we going to be able to talk about being climate neutral as far as the California dairy sector?
So first, Sarah and I have authored a white paper on climate neutrality for U.S. beef and dairy, which is available for free on the CLEAR Center, that's clear.ucdavis.edu webpage. And so for those of you who want to read details, you can, and you can even see calculations because there are spreadsheets that show the math. The most critical idea here to understand is if you cut methane, if you pull methane, if you reduce methane, then you're reducing warming. Okay, you're reducing warming. Not just are you slowing warming, you're reducing warming. If you reduce methane by enough, let's say by 20, 30, 40%, if you reduce it strongly, then you reduce so much warming that it offsets other greenhouse gases, such as nitrous oxide and CO2. And it can even offset historic emissions, stuff that you emitted years ago, and the related warming can be reduced by reducing methane. So we have set our goal as scientists and our teams and so on to find out when climate neutrality can occur for US beef and dairy, also for California dairy and beef. And we have found that if we continue to do on a path like we have started, with strong manure-related reductions and strong also enteric reductions, along with some herd size reductions, which we have seen, we just projected the ones over the last few years to continue, then it can happen within the next 10 years. And that is super fast, super aggressive, that this sector can reach a point of climate neutrality. I want to be very clear about this. This is not some kind of creative accounting, greenwashing, or any of that. This is using hard science and the knowledge of physics around these gases and their chemical properties, and then projecting what strong reductions will do. We are not suggesting at all business as usual. We are suggesting an aggressive means of further progressing on the path that we have engaged on, continuing on that path, because this sector will become climate neutral in the future.
Great. And I know, so the national beef producers have set a climate neutral goal. Can you talk a little bit about that and where we're at with that?
Yeah, so as was referenced earlier, right, we think about all these different goals out there. That is a unique goal that is out there from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. And in a couple of weeks, there will be an announcement from the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef in terms of their goal as well, right? I won't preview that here, but, check it out. It will be announced on April 27th. But what is the opportunity in beef looks a little bit different than dairy, right? And this is where, all cattle are beef cattle, some cattle are dairy cattle, but the emissions profile of the two industries is a bit different. And what it really comes down to is enteric methane is a much larger proportion of the methane emissions for beef cattle production as compared to dairy. And there's actually very little manure methane. So that really kind of hones us in on this opportunity that we have with potential new technologies to reduce enteric methane emissions from cattle production. That's going to be especially important for the beef cattle industry to achieve this goal of climate neutrality, as Frank outlined, right? Because ultimately there are going to be two main levers, if you will, to pull, which is reducing methane strongly, as was noted, and the ability to offset other emissions associated with beef cattle production. And then the other key thing and opportunity, which also has a lot of question marks around it, is the ability to change soil carbon sequestration, right? That's also an area where we need a lot more science. We need to understand the proper way to measure and validate that. But those are the two key opportunities on the beef cattle side, just because there are hundreds of millions of acres that are managed under the control of beef cattle producers in the US. And the fact that, again, these animals are mostly consuming forage and out on grass, so very little manure emissions. There's manure nitrous oxide, that's really hard to control, but more about the enteric methane for the beef industry.
And you brought up enteric, and that's an important topic here in California too, because California, as I said earlier, has very ambitious goals, and it's not just to reduce manure methane, but the state would very much like to see us reduce enteric methane in the dairy and livestock sector by 40% as well. What's going to be key to that? I know there's some feed additives that have been approved in the European Union and South America. There's lots of discussion around seaweed and the need to scale up seaweed production that has shown it can be effective in certain cases. But I'd love to get your thoughts on what really needs to happen to get the enteric solution. Sounds like important for the beef industry, but important for us too in the dairy sector here in California. What needs to happen?
So in the Animal Science Department at UC Davis, my colleague Ermias Cabriab and I have done, must have been dozens of studies on various types of feed additives to reduce enteric methane, or the methane that's belched out by cattle. And We found that of the majority of those things, most of them don't work. Approximately 5 to 10 do work at different rates of effectiveness. I would say 5 of them really work well. And here we saw reductions anywhere between 10 to 50%. And here the challenges are different. One of these feed additives is a chemical additive that's chemically produced. It would have to achieve FDA approval, Food and Drug Administration approval, and that route is unlikely to happen. So we have that barrier right now within the FDA, treating it pretty much like a drug. And there are other additives, and they are considered, that's what they're called, generally recognized as safe. And that means you can sell them, but you cannot market them with the label claim of methane reductions. So they can sell those additives, these companies can, and say, well, you might achieve greater production performance, milk yield, or whatever. But they're not allowed to say, if you feed this stuff, you reduce your methane by 20%. And if they're not allowed to do that, if they're not allowed to say that, why would they spend any money into researching and getting it onto the market for purpose of methane reduction? We have to change the way we deal with these additives, and we have to make sure that those that are likely to work will be market ready as soon as possible. I mean, as soon as possible. I know of only one that currently is available on the market, but the company can't say, if you feed this, you reduce methane by X%. That's a problem.
Is there anything you'd like to add on that, or I've got one
Yeah.
last?
Yeah, nope. I think that really covers it. We just need to make sure that we have the right regulatory framework and research and development funding to match the level of interest and the need to reduce methane emissions from cattle.
Yeah, I think the interest is certainly there, and we're down to a couple of minutes, and so I want to kind of end it on a broad note. We've got a really broad mix of stakeholders listening today, from dairy farmers and industry leaders to policymakers to dairy customers. So if you could leave our audience today with just one takeaway message, what would it be? And you each have about a minute. So Frank, why don't you go first and save Sarah a minute to give her answer as well.
So I think what's most important for everybody to understand is the dairy industry, the beef industry want to reduce emissions. They want to reduce particularly methane emissions because they know this is a great lever. We have seen that there are public policy tools that help accelerate and facilitate the use of technologies to reduce methane. And we have seen, because it's quantifiable, how significant a reduction that can be. I'm working, and colleagues of mine are working with these industries to set goals to achieve climate neutrality in the years to come. The industry is interested in achieving that. I think we now all have to work together, because it is extremely important that something that is possible and that's likely to happen will happen, because stakeholders work together hand in hand and get the job done.
Wow, that was perfect. And Sarah, you got a minute. What's your takeaway message?
Yeah, well, ditto to that, right? And if we think about what our opportunity is, I think climate neutrality is definitely within reach. It's technically possible. There's the desire to do it, as was just alluded to. The industries have set goals. They want to move towards this. And I think we're really at a point now where we've talked a lot about sustainability. We've talked a lot about these emissions, but now it's a time for action, right? And so it's thinking about how can we remove barriers, whether they're regulatory barriers to access some of these technologies, or also thinking about the barriers to measurement, adoption, implementation, incentives, as we've talked about, right? We've got to start creating that positive flywheel that drives innovation in the real world and results in absolute emission reductions while still producing incredibly desirable beef and dairy products, right? So I think we can strike that balance. It's an exciting time in animal agriculture, and we just need to, again, move towards action and actually getting this stuff done now.
Thank you both so much. Those were great comments and a great conversation today. Thank you for letting me be a part of it. I'm not a PhD, but I like to play one sometimes. So this was great for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.